I have the distinct honor of introducing you to someone who is known fondly throughout the Black community as Sister President. Dr. Johnnetta Cole, an illustrious member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority and the Lynx Incorporated, is recognized throughout the world for her stellar leadership of Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, elevating it to one of the premier women's colleges in America. As it turns out, one of the most powerful group of African-American women in the Twin Cities belongs to the Spelman Alumni Association of the Twin Cities. Believe me, if you want to know a powerful woman in Twin Cities, all you need to know is whether or not they're a Spelman graduate. Moreover, I should say that whenever you see a field of black women in red hats anywhere in the world, then you will know that they are doctors. So all the doctors are sitting back there. Dr. Cole attended Fisk University, graduated summa cum laude from Oberlin College, and obtained her PhD in anthropology from Northwestern University. She did her dissertation field research in Liberia, West Africa in 1960, 1961 through a Northwestern University project designed to produce the first economic survey of Liberia. I came to know the scholarly contributions of Dr. Cole when I was a Fulbright lecturer in economics at Covington University College in Bond County, Liberia, whose library housed copies of the original surveys and the research reports conducted by Dr. Cole and her colleagues at Northwestern. Her fieldwork produced the definitive labor market analysis of traditional versus wage-earning laborers in Liberia. She offers a perceptive but sensitive analysis of the Poro and the Sandy societies. These are the secret societies within tribal life among many tribal groups in Liberia. And in doing so, she helped Westerners understand the differential attachment to the labor market among tribal members. Dr. Cole is the granddaughter of Abraham Lincoln Lewis, Florida's first black billionaire, entrepreneur, and co-founder of the Afro-American Industrial and Benefit Society. She is the great-great-granddaughter of former slave Anna Jai, who was a Wolof princess originally from present-day Senegal. I first met Dr. Cole in Senegal at the African American Leadership Summit that was hosted by Reverend Leon Sullivan, who served on the board of the National Association for Equal Opportunity in Higher Education, the membership organization of the 117 historically black colleges and universities. The trip was packed with the leading African American scholars, academics, politicians, musicians, actors, religious leaders. What I remember most about Dr. Cole was her outreach to the dozen or so young women who were on the trip, including one who is now the second assistant curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And she asked me to remind Dr. Cole that it was because of her encounter with Dr. Cole on the beach in Senegal that this young lady decided to pursue a PhD in art history. And so Dr. Cole has had a tremendous impact on literally thousands of black women in America. Dr. Cole started the very first African American Studies program in the United States at Washington State University. And then she proceeded, when she was a professor of anthropology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, she proceeded to establish the first African-American Studies program at that university. When Dr. Cole became the president of Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, she earned the distinction of becoming the only person to head both of the historic Black women's colleges in America. Until 2017, she successfully led the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, the only national museum in the United States dedicated to the collection, exhibition, conservation, and the study of arts in Africa. I'm pleased to introduce to you Sister President.
Good evening. Thank you, Brother Professor. You know, there's nothing in the world more powerful and important than a teacher. Now, we use a fancy word and we say professor. And I want to say to you, Brother Professor Myers, thank you for being the inspiring, powerful teacher that you are. And then I want to turn to the Sister Dean. And here's what I want to say to you. Words of an African proverb. It says, when women lead, streams run uphill. It's an extraordinary privilege for me to receive an award that is associated with the great public servant, Hubert H. Humphrey. And I would like to do at this moment what I have started to do as a tradition for me, and it is to dedicate whatever speechifying, as my sons call it, that I do. And tonight I want to dedicate my remarks to two sheroes. One, the incomparable Dr. Josie Johnson. And the other shero is an individual that you will know because of her leadership role at Target. Her name is Caroline Wanga, but I have named her the Force. I want to center my remarks around the concept of kinship. So let me begin by greeting each of you as my sisters, my brothers, my siblings all. Now clearly, at least to the best of my knowledge, I am not biologically related to anybody in this gathering. But as I learned as a student of anthropology, kinship is about more than biology. Kinship is fundamentally, it's about shared values. And thus all of you are my kinfolk in the sense that we all share the value of public service. There are two other ways in which my remarks are centered on an expanded notion of kinship. One, I want to share with you a particular and special way that I and related to the great public servant, Hubert H. Humphrey. And two, I want to end with a call that binds us to each other like the closest of kin, a call to be of service. For as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? I never met Hubert H. Humphrey, but during the period that I served as the director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, I had the honor of nominating his niece, Anne Howard Tristani, to the advisory board of that museum. And during the last few years of my directorship, Anne served on that board, and she continues to do so. I have not met them, but I want to acknowledge, if they are present, Anne's brother, the nephew of Vice President Humphrey, Judge William R. Howard, and his wife, Julie. Now let me briefly tell you the story of how and why I feel that I am a kinswoman of Hubert H. Humphrey. And I must ultimately say, not ultimately, but immediately say, that I also feel akin to his sister, Frances Humphrey Howard. Now, in telling this special story, I'm going to, of course, draw on what anthropologists draw on, what I've heard from the people, particularly from Anne Howard Tristani. The story begins in 1963, when two United States foreign officers met, foreign service officers. The one was Frances Humphrey Howard. The other was a man by the name of Warren Robins. Now, Warren Robins was the founder of the Museum of African Art on Capitol Hill. When they met, Louise Humphrey Howard promised, I don't know if they did it, but you know, when I was growing up, we do the pinky promise. Promised, she did, Warren Robins, that she would introduce him to her brother, Hubert Humphrey. Warren Robins was the founder of the Museum of African Art. He had collected African art, though he had never been to the continent. And he placed that African art first in a house in which the great abolitionist and feminist Frederick Douglass had once lived. And so Senator Humphrey's sister, Louise Humphrey Howard, was one of the founding members of the board of Warren Robins Museum. Fast forward now to 1978. Louise Humphrey Howard played a pivotal role in convincing Senator Humphrey to introduce legislation to transfer the Museum of African Art on Capitol Hill to the Smithsonian Institution. Now, according to Anne, my sister friend, according to Anne, shortly before her uncle, Hubert Humphrey, passed away, January 13th, 1978 was the date. Before he passed away, Hubert Humphrey received a call from his sister. His sister, Louise Humphrey Howard, urged him to introduce legislation that would transfer the Museum of African Art on Capitol Hill to the Smithsonian Institution. Do you all know this history and her story? If you don't, I'm telling it to you right now. Now, Hubert Humphrey was too ill to return to the Senate, so he called Senator Wendell Anderson of Minnesota to ask him to introduce the bill that would transfer the Museum of African Art to the Smithsonian. The bill was indeed introduced by Senator Anderson following Senator Humphrey's passing. It was unanimously endorsed by Congress as a tribute to Senator, U.S. Vice President, and of course, Mayor Hubert H. Humphrey. Now, let me make it perfectly clear about kinship. Anthropologists care a lot about kinship. The connection that I have to members of the Humphrey family is that I had the distinct privilege, the joy of serving as the director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art for 8 years, a museum that would not exist had not the great Hubert H. Humphrey been urged by his sister to pass that legislation. I want to add 2 proscripts to this story of my kinship with Hubert Humphrey and his sister. First, I am currently serving as the 7th president and the chair of the board of the National Council of Negro Women. This organization of organizations, founded in 1935 by the legendary Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, was later, for 40 years, led by the iconic Dr. Dorothy Irene Height. Today, the National Council of Negro Women has a membership of over 2 million Black women. Here is the way in which I now have a kinship with Louise Humphrey Howard. You never know who your kinfolk are unless you get into it. We were both colleagues and friends of Dr. Dorothy Irene Height. Here's the second postscript. Whenever I greeted a formal gathering of folk at the National Museum of African Art, I would begin by saying, "Welcome home." It doesn't matter what your race is, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your religion, your class, your nationality, your ability or disability. You are home. For you are in a place that exhibits and educates about art that comes from the only place on earth from which we have all descended, Africa. And as I'm fond of saying, the sooner white folk acknowledge that they are Africans, the better the world's going to be. And so now I want to turn to the final notion of kinship that I want to address. It is this. Our very presence this evening signals that each of us has some degree of commitment to public service. Whether you are here as a member of the faculty, the staff, whether you are an administrator, a member of the board, a student, or a friend of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, you have associated yourself just by being here with a school that prepares individuals for leadership and public service. We are kindred souls in the sense that, like Hubert Humphrey, each of us believes that we have a responsibility to do something for the common good. Mayor, Senator, Vice President Humphrey was a committed activist who spent his life in search of solutions to problems of poverty, of unemployment, of discrimination, and of war. He amassed one of the most prolific legislative records in the history of the United States Senate, as he sponsored hundreds of bills, including a bill on Medicare, the establishment of the Peace Corps, the nuclear test ban treaty. However, for me, his most memorable and enduring achievements were in the areas of civil and human rights. You will all remember that it was during the 1948 Democratic National Convention that the 37-year-old mayor of Minnesota delivered an historic and compelling speech that challenged the racist ideology, the racist leadership of the United States Senate. In that speech, he called on delegates, quote, to get out of the darkness of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. And the mayor invited folk to do that by adopting the Minority Civil Rights Plan. Almost 2 decades later, Hubert Humphrey's extensive network of church and civil rights leaders joined with him to break the longest filibuster in Senate history, resulting in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so, my sisters, my brothers, my siblings all, I bring closure on my remarks by calling on all of us to be kindred souls with Hubert Humphrey in courageously speaking up, speaking out, and fighting for human and civil rights. As Hubert Humphrey said, you can always debate about what you should have done. The question is, what are you going to do? Thank you.